In this decade, NASA hopes to return humans to the moon through the US-led Artemis program. The Orion spacecraft for Artemis 1 is now orbiting the moon and will eventually return after the assignment. The NASA-led Artemis program includes this Artemis 1 mission as a component of its ongoing space program. Watch this video to the end to learn all the details. The Apollo program, how NASA launched people to the moon. NASA's mission to put humans on the moon in the 1960s and early 1970s was known as the Apollo program. Apollo 11's triumph in 1969, which allowed humans to walk on the moon's surface for the first time ever, allowed the United States to declare victory over the Soviet Union in the Cold War space race. According to NASA, the Apollo program had 11 space missions in all starting in 1961. 6 of the other 7 missions successfully landed people on the moon, and 4 of those missions tested technology. In 1968, the first crew flight took place, and the last mission was carried out in 1972. 12 men had explored the moon's surface by the time the Apollo missions came to a conclusion, conducting research and collecting rocks to bring back to scientists on Earth more than 50 years after being gathered. These materials are still being used to produce new discoveries. The space race, a struggle between the capitalist US and the communist Soviet Union over dominance in space, started in 1957 and gave rise to the Apollo program. In his infamous 1961 moon speech at Rice University in Texas, US President John F. Kennedy challenged the newly established NASA to land men on the moon and return them safely at the beginning of the race when the Russians were leading. NASA's Mercury mission, which ran from 1959 to 1963 and sent one-person teams into orbit to test whether people could survive and function in space, served as the foundation for Apollo. The agency's Gemini program, which spanned from 1962 to 1966 and comprised 2-person missions, testing numerous maneuvers and parts necessary for landing on the moon, came after that. According to Spaceflight Insider, the Apollo program required an enormous amount of work and employed almost 500,000 Americans. According to the Planetary Society, the program's whole lifetime costs came to $28 billion, or $283 billion when inflation is taken into account. Why the Artemis mission might be the last for NASA astronauts. In 1969, Neil Armstrong made history when he took one little stride on the moon. The final Apollo crew left our planetary neighbor just 3 years later. Since then, hundreds of humans have been sent into space, mostly to the International Space Station that orbits the Earth. In actuality, none has traveled farther than a few hundred kilometers from Earth. However, the US-led Artemis program wants to send people back to the moon this decade. As part of its maiden test trip, Artemis 1 is currently returning to Earth after orbiting the moon. The greatest advancements in robotics and computing power between the Apollo era and the middle of the 21st century are these two. Superpower competition also no longer justifies exorbitant expenditures, as it did during the Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union. One could argue that these changes weaken the case for the project. The Space Launch System, the most powerful rocket ever and a design similar to the Saturn V rockets that sent 12 Apollo astronauts to the moon, is being used by NASA for the Artemis mission. The Artemis booster, like its forerunners, mixes liquid hydrogen and oxygen to produce tremendous lifting power before plummeting into the water and being lost forever. Therefore, it is projected that each launch will cost between $2 and $4 billion. This contrasts with its SpaceX rival, Starship, which enables the company to recover and reuse the first stage. Let us discuss the use of robotics in space. The suite of rovers on Mars, where Perseverance, NASA's newest prospector, can drive independently through rugged terrain with just sporadic direction from Earth, serves as an example of advancements in robotic exploration. The robots themselves will be further empowered by advances in sensors and artificial intelligence to recognize particularly interesting areas from which to collect samples for return to Earth. Robotic exploration of the Martian surface could become almost fully autonomous within the next 2 decades, with the presence of humans having little benefit. Similar to this, engineering tasks no longer call for human involvement, including scientists' goal of building a sizable radio telescope on the moon's far side, which is free of interference from Earth. These tasks can be completed totally by robots. Robots can stay on the job site permanently, unlike astronauts who need a comfortable location to dwell if they are needed for building. Robots may even be used to mine the soil on the moon or from asteroids for rare materials, if it proves economically feasible to do so. Since lengthy travels of several years pose little greater difficulty to a robot than the 6-month trip to Mars, robots may likewise visit Jupiter, Saturn, and their fascinatingly different moons without incurring high additional costs. In fact, the oceans beneath several of these moons moons may contain life. Even if we could send people there, it might not be a good idea because they might bring microorganisms from Earth with them. Now onto the trade-off in using astronauts or robotics in space exploration. The Apollo astronauts were brave people. They took on significant risks and advanced technology to its fullest. In contrast, brief journeys to the moon will seem relatively ordinary in the 2020s, despite the $90 billion cost of the Artemis program. It will take something more ambitious, like a Mars landing, to inspire popular enthusiasm on the order of Apollo. However, such a journey might easily cost NASA $1 trillion, including supplies and the necessary rocketry for a return trip. This is problematic spending, given the climate catastrophe and the widespread poverty on Earth. NASA's current safety culture response to public perceptions has resulted in the high price tag. This is a reflection of the trauma and ensuing program delays that followed the space shuttle tragedies in 1986 and 2003, each of which claimed the lives of the 7 onboard citizens. Nevertheless, the shuttle, which made a total of 135 launches, managed to attain a failure rate of under 2%. Expecting a failure rate for a return journey to Mars to be as low would be absurd because the mission would take 2 full years. Simply put, astronauts require much more maintenance than robots do. Both their space flights and their activities on Earth require them to have access to air, water, food, living quarters, and radiation protection, particularly from solar storms. The cost differences between human and robotic missions are already significant for a trip to the moon, but they would increase significantly for any extended stay. A trip to Mars, which is hundreds of times farther away than the moon, would put astronauts at much higher risk and make it much harder to provide emergency help. Even space enthusiasts acknowledge that it might take approximately 2 decades before the first crewed mission to Mars takes place. There will undoubtedly be thrill seekers and explorers who are willing to take on much greater risks. Some have even agreed to participate in previously suggested one-way trips. This highlights a crucial distinction between the Apollo period and the present: the growth of a robust private space technology industry that now supports human spaceflight. Now that the private sector is competing with NASA, interested volunteers may crew high-risk, low-cost missions to Mars funded by billionaires and commercial sponsors. Ultimately, the general public might applaud these daring explorers without having to pay for them. It is debatable if NASA's multi-billion-dollar Artemis project is a smart use of public funds, given that human spaceflight beyond low orbit is very likely to totally transfer to privately funded missions willing to accept great risks. In the end, Artemis is more likely to be a farewell than the beginning of a new Apollo age. Beautiful pictures of the moon are taken by Artemis 1's Orion spacecraft during its closest approach. As the Artemis 1 mission made its closest approach to the moon on Monday, November 21st, NASA's Orion spacecraft took stunning pictures of the moon as it flew barely 81.1 miles above the lunar surface. On day 6 of the mission, when it carried out a critical engine burn, the Orion spacecraft's onboard optical navigation camera captured these in-depth black and white pictures. On Friday, Orion performed a crucial maneuver that placed the spacecraft in a high orbit around the moon. If all went well, it is expected that the spacecraft executed a single engine run and would spend roughly a week in lunar orbit before starting its return trip to Earth. On December 11th, the spacecraft is expected to splash down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California. The Orion spacecraft's onboard optical navigation camera captured these in-depth black and white pictures on day 6 of the mission, which was also the day it carried out a significant engine burn. According to the image descriptions posted on NASA's Flickr account, Orion has been at work taking pictures of Earth and the moon at various phases and distances to test the efficiency of its optical navigation camera under various lighting conditions in order to aid spacecraft orientation during upcoming crewed missions. Artemis 1 is a pioneering mission to validate the Orion spacecraft and NASA's powerful Space Launch System rocket for use on future Artemis program missions. If all goes well, the two might launch men to the moon's vicinity during Artemis 2 as early as 2024, marking the first time since 1972. A year or so later, the Artemis 3 spacecraft will set down men close to the moon's south pole. There are currently 3 Artemis missions underway. Artemis 1, an unmanned test flight that will circle and fly past the moon. Artemis 2, a crewed flight beyond the moon that will carry humans farther than they've ever traveled in space. And Artemis 3. Do not forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video. Bye!